Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and their ancestors as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, and recognise their unique contribution to our environmental and cultural heritage, past, present, and future. And I extend my respect to all Indigenous people in attendance today. Well, welcome to the NATSEM Budget Luncheon on the 2014 federal budget, organised in collaboration with Michael Keating, Roger Hausman, and Inside Canberra. There's the plug. My name is Mark Evans, and I'm Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra, which is the proud home to the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling and the ANZOG Institute for Governance. The Institute was established earlier this year with a strong social mission, committed to the production of high-quality research with genuine public value and policy impact. And the integration of NATSEM and ANZIG has created unique opportunities for leading-edge research in public policy analysis. It brings together quantitative and qualitative public policy analysis, microsimulation, and policy modelling. And this is proving a very attractive mix, as it has enabled us to attract 4 of the top 20 public policy scholars in the world over the last year. This event forms part of the Institute's Parliamentary Triangle seminar series, which is normally televised as part of the ABC's Big Ideas programme today, but today it will be televised by Sky News. The purpose of the seminar is to provide a neutral space for bringing together politicians, public servants, political commentators, academics, and members of the public in a way that they can feel free to discuss critical public policy issues confronting Australia in an open and frank way. Our debate this lunchtime was foreshadowed in the last issue of Inside Canberra, where Michael McCormack, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance, presented an elegant defence of the budget. For those of you wishing during this session to follow a Twitter feed, please use hashtag Budget2014. So without any further ado, let me hand you over to our Master of Ceremonies this lunchtime, Paul Porteous, Director of the Centre for Post-Crisis Leadership and Development at the Institute. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Mark, and welcome again. We're delighted to see so many people here, and as you see, we've got a fantastic panel that's going to be looking at the budget. One of the issues is that we had invited members of the government to participate, but they were unable to come. So I just want to put that in, that we have tried to get a broad range of people for the panel. One of the things we often say about budgets is that they're a reflection of the values and the priorities of the communities and societies we work in. And it's been interesting that we've seen so much debate being generated from this budget, particularly as people have thrown around words, trust, inequality and the like. It's almost in a sense galvanised many voices which in the past have maybe taken a bit more of a back seat. In a sense, a lot more seems at stake. And as people reflect on what does it mean, many are asking, is this a budget that represents a game changer? Is it a big shift, or is it sort of more of the same? Our panel is going to be trying to tease some of this out. But some of the research that we've done in the Institute in the past has been interesting, because often we're told people are quite apathetic about politics and in a sense don't want to get engaged. But some of our research showed that about 70% of people who were part of this research said that they were very satisfied with the democratic system in Australia and with democracy. But equally, 70% said they were dissatisfied with the party political system. So you've got this balance as we try to get the politics right compared to what are the values that are being represented within the community. So with today's presenters, we're really going to try and tease out some of these issues. Is the budget a response to a budget emergency and a crisis and a credible response? Or is it more of being blinded by the vision of budget surpluses and actually narrowing the field rather than broadening it? Is this about trying to balance the different interests within a community, which is about what governance is and politics, or has it ended up being more about ideological myopia? So some of these issues are ones we want to try and tease out as we go along today. And of course, we've got a great panel to do that. I'll introduce them in more detail as each one comes to the front. But just to give you a quick view, we'll have Ben Phillips speaking first, who's the Principal Research Fellow at NATSEM at our Institute of Governance and Policy Analysis. He'll be followed by John Daley, who's the CEO of the Grattan Institute, and you would have heard him quite often in the media. Thirdly, Andrew Leigh, Shadow Assistant Treasurer and Federal Member for Fraser, and also a former Professor of Economics at the ANU. And finally, Michelle Grattan, as we know, one of Australia's most influential journalists, and also the Chief Political Correspondent at The Conversation, as well as a Professorial Fellow at our own University of Canberra. So we're delighted to invite them, and Ben, we might start with you. We've asked each to give a 10-minute presentation as we go through, and then we're going to open it up. We'll have some discussion, and we'll open it up for questions. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming along today. So as you may well have heard of in the media over the last couple of days, NATSEM has undertaken a considerable amount of modelling work on the federal budget, 2014-15 budget. We were commissioned by Bill Shorten's office to consider what are the distributional impacts of this budget. How is that pain shared? So is it the low-income groups? Is it the high-income groups? Is it families with kids? Is it single persons? Where's the lie of the land with this budget? Who is it that's been impacted the most? To undertake this piece of work, it was a very large piece of work, and I was in the budget lockup. It was a little bit scary, the amount of work that I knew was in front of me. There was a huge number of measures that needed to be changed in our modelling that we do each year. The model that we use is a model called StinMod, and this is a model that will be well known to many people within, so the Commonwealth Treasury, Department of Social Services and Employment. So this is the model that the government uses and NATSEM uses as well. It's a model that we developed over the past 20 years and is generally used for analysing a full package of modelling, of policy changes, looking at the household impacts, so who wins, who loses, whether it's high income groups, low income groups, and to some extent what the cost of certain changes in policy are. So that's what I run through today, is what is effectively the difference between where Labor was taking us and where this new budget or the coalition is taking us. So it's the difference between the two, which families win, which families lose, and effectively by how much. So in terms of what was modelled, there was around about 18 measures in the budget which NATSEM has modelled. So these are all of the changes to family payments. It's also changes to youth allowance, to unemployment payments, range of pensions and allowances. We've also included the carbon price, so the removal of the carbon price, so that will be a net positive for families, of course, not having the carbon price there. Also the school kids bonus. It doesn't line up exactly with the budget. It lines up with a comparison of Labor v Liberal, effectively, or Labor v the coalition. Now, our modelling is not so much to, evaluate the individual merits of particular policies. So as I read it, there are some policies that perhaps make a lot of sense. There's some other policies that are perhaps a little on the concerning side. But the point of this analysis is just to look at that distributional impact of who wins, who loses, is the pain being shared, is the key question that we're looking into. So we undertake to do this two key kinds of analysis. One is called a hypothetical modelling. One is called a distributional modelling. So the hypothetical modelling is where you've got, say, a couple with kids. So they've got a 6-year-old and a 12-year-old. They've got an income of, say, $30,000 for the father, $20,000 for the mother. What are the benefits they receive? What's the tax that they pay? What we do is we compare the two policies. So the ALP projection through time, 2014-15 to 2017-18, we compare where those households would be, or where that hypothetical household would be, under Labor and under Liberal. So how much do they gain or how much do they lose? So we've done that for a whole range of families. We've done that for couples, we've done it for singles, we've done it for single parents, families with kids. And we've looked at also different income levels. So that's what's called cameo analysis or hypothetical modelling. We've also looked at distributional modelling. And this is where, so sometimes with the cameo analysis, you might find that there's particular families that are adversely impacted, but you don't know how many of those families there are. So the distributional modelling looks at the entirety of all Australian households, or in this case families. We have around 12 million families that we effectively investigate, and we base it on around about 45,000 different families that are in the survey that underlies the STINMOD model, and the survey is based on ABS Survey of Income and Housing. So I guess the major finding that we have is that, quite stunningly in fact, the impact of this budget is almost entirely at the low end of the income distribution. So when we talk about the income distribution, we look at the bottom 20% of households in different increments up to the top 20% of families. And we look at the budget impact for each of those groups separately. We can also look at it by different family types, so say a low-income couple with kids or a high-income couple with kids. And we find that the results are quite stunning in that it's very much the low-income families that are impacted by this budget. And I'll run through some of those results. In terms of the hypotheticals, and there's already been a little bit around this in the media, we generally find that the impacts do increase through time. So there's a number of reasons for that. The changes that have been made to, say, family payments, they've frozen some payments. There's been changes to the way the income testing arrangements are made, so there's a freeze to the income testing, and that tends to impact the low-income families with regards to their take-home pay. So in 2014-15, we tend to find that, say, a low-income couple or a low-income single person will be behind by around $1,800 per year. In 2014-15, that's mostly the school kids bonus and a few changes with regards to family payments, but that's relatively minor. The main impact is when you go out into the forward estimates. So for 2017-18, or even actually before then, with the loss of the family tax benefit Part B, that's a very substantial hit to families, along with a whole range of other elements that go into this analysis. And we find that for a low-income family, they'll be worse off by around $4,000 per year. For some families, as you creep up a little bit higher in the income distribution, it actually increases. So for some families, there was a loss of over $6,000. And there would be some families with more children where perhaps you would actually have even larger losses. So I guess that was one of the more startling results for me, was that, say if you're on no income at all, your loss would be around $4,000. If your income is around an average weekly wage, it's actually higher. And the mantra, of course, is earn or learn. But what we are finding is that as the more you earn, actually the more that you lose. So A, you're getting less in welfare, but B, those effective marginal tax rates, or the incentive to actually work, are actually more of a disincentive as you increase your income. So it's more of just a simple hit to families rather than any particularly obvious benefit or incentive to get back into the workforce. In terms of the distributional results, we also include the carbon price impact. We also include the indexation to petrol, which is only a very small element of the equation. But the carbon price for a low-income family may be around about $100 per week. This is at a $6 price in 2014-15. That increases to around $250, $300 in 2017-18, and it's higher for a high-income family. So that's an actual benefit to families with the removal of the carbon price. So what we do find is that, and again, not surprisingly, it's the low-income families who are impacted by far and away the most. We find in 2014-15, the impact is not particularly huge. It's around about the $2,000 per year for a couple families with kids that are low incomes. Around about 95 to 100% of families that are low income are impacted. High income families, it's more like only about 30%. And their impact is only around $700 per year in that 2014-15 year. And the reason for that, of course, is that some of them are paying the deficit levy or the budget repair levy, but they're not impacted by the changes to family payments, they're not impacted by the freezes to income testing and a range of other elements. When you move out to 2017-18, in fact probably even 15-16, that's where you see the really large impacts. And we do see that the low-income families, the bottom 20%, they're impacted by around about 10% of their income, so a 10% hit to their disposable income as a result of taking away FTB Part B, as a result of the payment freezes and a range of other elements. We actually find that in 2017-18, the high income groups, the top 20% of households, Not only are they not impacted, they actually have a positive increase to their disposable incomes, which might be a surprise to many. But what goes on there is that the carbon price has been removed. They tend to have a slightly higher carbon price liability than low incomes. So they get a gain there of around $600 per week. So it's quite a substantial difference there. And the groups that are impacted the most is very much the low-income single mothers, low-income couples with kids. They're the groups that are impacted by far and away the most. As you go up the income scale, the actual impact is reduced, and by the time you get to the top 20%, because there's no budget levy in 17-18, that actually disappears 1 July 2017, they're actually better off as a result of this budget. So overall, we find that there's about 1.25 million low-income families in the bottom 40% who are impacted, who'll be worse off as a result of this budget. Average impact is around $3,000 per household, so that can vary anywhere between about 5, 12, 13, 14% of their disposable income. High-income families eventually are better off as a result of this budget. Interestingly enough, we didn't actually model the paid parental leave scheme, but the total quantum of savings is around $4 to $5 billion per year of the 20 measures that we've investigated. It's actually less than the total quantum of the paid parental leave scheme. Now, if you add the paid parental leave scheme in, that would again mostly impact at middle and high income families. And it's around about $5 billion. So the quantum of the savings is not even quite as large as the paid parental leave scheme when that's introduced in, I think, 2015. Now, there are actually probably some good measures in this budget. There's a few elements that I think you'd certainly give a tick to in the policy space. Indexation of petrol probably should never have been stopped being indexed. Also, family tax benefit Part B beyond $100,000. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense to be paying single income families $3,500 or $4,500 per year. We are wanting to improve the incentives there for participation in the workforce. But I guess the area where I think, and it might be an area where John would be talking about later, is that there has been an erosion of the tax base in Australia, and it would be that tax base, so things like concessions for superannuation. It's about $20 billion a year of lower income tax that families are paying, of successive governments' reductions to income. These are the areas where perhaps you could be doing more work. Fringe benefits tax concessions, family trusts as well. There's a whole range of tax areas where we've eroded away that tax base, and that's perhaps where we could be balancing up this equation between the low-income families and the high-income families. And that is all, guys. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben. And I should have mentioned earlier on, of course, Ben is responsible for the NATSEM model of the Australian tax and transfer system. So that, his work has been measuring the impact on Australian families. And certainly the picture you paint is so many different parts of this, but perhaps in the balance at the end, the inequalities still remain quite strongly from the work you've been doing. Next up, please, is John Daley, who's CEO of the independent Grattan Institute, and he's 20 years' experience in public, private and the university sectors, and they've produced a substantial report on the state of the nation's finances called, of course, Balancing Budgets. Tough choices we need. Now the budget's come out, he can reflect on how well that worked out. Over to you, John. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to NATSEM for the opportunity to be here today. You started with a question about, well, do we have a budget emergency? And some of you may have seen my comments elsewhere arguing that we do not have the kind of budget emergency where the patient is on the table with no pulse and a number of surgeons standing around looking very worried. But we do have a budget which is overweight and not exercising very much and definitely eating too much cheese. And we all know how that ends in the long run. But of course, there is never a short run to that kind of problem. It's a question of when do you finally decide to make the decision to start exercising a bit more and eat a little bit less cheese and hopefully wind up more healthy. And in terms of how unhealthy, I mean, we have had an underlying structural budget deficit of 2 or 3% of GDP for the last 6 years in a row. And remember, the whole point about calculating a structural budget deficit is that you take out the impact of the financial crisis, you take out the impact of the mining boom, and you ask, where are we? So by definition, at least in theory, a structural budget deficit should always be pretty close to zero. Because the whole point is that that's the underlying game that's going on. And that's not where we have been. And as we see, to some extent, the financial crisis now receding, and as we see the terms of trade starting to fall off and the mining boom slowing down, we're starting to see that that underlying budget is for real. Underlying budget deficit is for real. So how does this budget measure up against that? And the short answer is, it does make substantial moves over the medium run to getting the Australian budget or Commonwealth budget back into surplus. Question, of course, is, well, why do we want to do this? Why do we care? I guess the answers we would provide would be threefold. One is, when you run a deficit, what you do is that, in effect, you say that today's spending is going to be paid for by tomorrow's taxpayers, and there is a fundamental issue of fairness around that. Now, the only exception to that is if you are genuinely investing on behalf of tomorrow's taxpayers. I'll say a little bit more about infrastructure investment in a moment. But it's also true that most of the increase in Australian government spending, both Commonwealth level and state level, over the last decade has in fact been for health, and primarily for the health spending on older people. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that's a perfectly sensible thing to do, but it is very difficult to argue that it is an investment in our future. It's meaning that many people live longer and happier lives, but many of them are probably at the point where they're unlikely to be contributing substantially to the economy of the future. So that's why we care. We're essentially borrowing from the future, and of course, as you run budget deficits, you gradually do see an increase in debt, and if you go into a financial crisis with a debt to GDP ratio of 15%, then life is probably going to be okay. If you go in with a debt to GDP of 40 or 50%, as a number of European countries did, then it can all go horribly wrong very, very quickly, as a number of European countries discovered, and really are still struggling out of. So that's why we care. This budget does get us some way, and it does so with a couple of things. The first thing is that it doesn't announce much in the way of substantial new spending or new tax cuts. And of course, I think that was one of the issues under the previous government, is that it was, as many people observed, it was very good at gross saving. It wasn't necessarily quite so good at net saving. You can analyse the budgets of the Rudd-Gillard governments, and you can see very substantial budget measures that had quite substantial positive impacts on the budget, but typically those savings were then spent on new initiatives. This budget is different. There are substantial saves, but they don't go into spending on new stuff by and large. But the big shift in this budget, although it's in fact continuing what was in the previous budgets, is essentially around bracket creep. So we're all talking about a return to surplus pretty much by about 17-18. About $10 billion of that, so if you like about a little bit more than 0.5% of GDP, is the consequence of the budget measures that we've heard so much about in the media. Everything from medical co-payments to changes in the way that the higher education contribution scheme works, to a whole series of other things. Net, that's worth about $13 billion up, if you like, and then the government spends an additional $3 billion on infrastructure. But the impact of bracket creep, just straight, ordinary, common garden bracket creep, is about $16 billion over the next 4 years. It's about a full % of GDP. It's actually the single biggest impact on the budget by quite some margin. Indeed, it's more than half of the return to surplus. It doesn't get anything like the same kind of airplay, but it is important. And in terms of its impact, if it's distributional impact, of course, bracket creep has no impact on the bottom 20% of taxpayers, because of bottom 20% of earners, because actually they don't pay tax at all. It has the largest impact at the middle. So if you take people who are in the 6th decile, if you like, bracket creep over the next 4 years will consume an extra 1.8% of their earnings. It's about $740 a week. And then for the top percentile, obviously in absolute dollar terms, top decile in absolute dollar terms, a larger effect, about $1,400, but only about 0.95% of their incomes disappearing in bracket creep because obviously they already have most of their income in higher income brackets. And just to put that in context, if you take an income earner on $250,000, so by definition we're talking about someone towards the top, bracket creep is going to take about 0.95% of their income over the next 4 years. The deficit levy, if it in fact continued, would take about an extra 0.6% of their income. So bracket creep is in fact doing even more damage to their incomes than the deficit levy we've heard so much about. So that's what I would describe as the big structural moves that are made in this budget. Number one, bracket creep, not talked about nearly enough. The Commonwealth budget papers used to have a really helpful table up the back that showed you the percentage of income that was coming, expressed as a percentage of GDP for income taxes, corporate taxes and indirect taxes, principally GST and fuel levy. That table has unfortunately mysteriously disappeared from this year's budget papers. It's not impossible to recreate it, but what it shows is corporate taxes and indirect taxes basically staying flat over the next 4 years of the forwards, but income taxes increasing about a whole % of GDP. Now, in terms of those specific budget measures, remembering that, as I said, in budgetary repair terms, they're actually relatively smaller, I think one of the issues is that there are some significant policy own goals. Maybe they were acceptable things to try 30 years ago when we didn't know so much about what really worked, but I don't think that they are things we should be doing today. And I think they're based on a somewhat mechanistic view of incentives that doesn't think about how the world really works. So, for example, we have proposals for work for the dole scheme because, of course, if people have to go and work for the dole, then they'll get a bunch of skills and then they'll wind up in paid employment, or at the very least they'll stop claiming unemployment benefits. That's the kind of mechanistic view of the world. But the reality, if you look at the history of those schemes, is that work for the dole schemes actually result in lower participation for the people who go on them. And that's because they wind up with this thing on their CV that frankly doesn't count very much for a future employer. In fact, it's probably got something of a stigma to it. By and large, they don't learn very much doing that because work for the dole schemes tend to be blunt, pretty low-skilled labour, planting trees, digging ditches kind of things. So that doesn't help you very much. And of course, because you're spending so much time doing it and getting to and from, you don't have enough time to go and actually look for a real job. And so the history, I think, shows, and Jeff Borland's done some excellent work at the University of Melbourne, that these schemes actually don't work that well. Similarly, you can look at what we are doing in medical co-payments. And of course, there's a crude, well, if we charge people money when they don't really need to go to the doctor, they won't go, and that's a good thing, and it saves us some money. And there's a certain intuitive, if you like, Bush economists' logic to that. But again, the reality is, and again, we've got good evidence to show that yes, some people will not go to the doctor who didn't really need to go, but a much larger number will not go to the doctor who did need to go, and consequently the loss will greatly exceed any of the savings. And the third one I would look at is the uncapping of the price that universities can charge. Because of course we have a free market in university places, and if we take the price off, then all that will mean is that we wind up with universities competing. Again, it's a very crude view of markets. The reality is that higher education markets are very imperfect. People, or students in particular, are very price insensitive precisely because the HEC scheme works so well, and consequently it is unlikely that students are going to put a lot of price pressure onto universities. Indeed, they haven't done it anywhere else in the world, and indeed Australia has had a deregulated price market for universities for a long time. There's nothing to stop universities charging less than the current maximum, and none of them do. It is not credible that the cost of providing education at the University of Southern Queensland is the same as the cost of providing that course at the University of Melbourne. I would be very surprised. And yet they charge exactly the same price. Indeed, when we also saw the same thing happen in the UK, the government allowed the maximum price to go up by 30%, and basically every single university in the UK lifted the price to the new ceiling. So that's why I'd suggest there's some somewhat crude views of the world that are maybe not quite where we would like them to be. My time is out, so I'll leave it there. In summary, We do have a budget problem. It's not a budget emergency, but it is a substantial problem, and it's a problem around deficit as opposed to debt, at least for the moment. It's a budget that makes some substantial moves in terms of solving that problem, albeit primarily through bracket creep. And it does so with a number of things which I suggest are based on a somewhat crude and mechanistic view of the way that people behave. And a more sophisticated approach to policy might reveal that some of those things are probably going to be own goals in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And sort of, it sort of follows that theme in a sense from Ben, this notion of a whole series of incentives that actually then become disincentives. I liked your image of the patient at the beginning, and then as you went on, you said, oh, of course, under this scheme, the patient wouldn't actually turn up to go to the doctors. So, we've got to look at where are the contradictions in this? How do we start to tease that out? And what does it mean when, in fact, the system left to its own devices through bracket creep and other things actually seems to deliver more of the goal of the government? As you said, there are policy-owned goals involved here that actually mitigate against the solutions which are being proposed. So next up is Andrew Leigh, Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Federal Member for Fraser and a former Professor of Economics at ANU, and many of you will be familiar with his book, all about inequality in the history of Australia, on battlers and billionaires. So I look forward to Andrew having a big picture view of this as well as the political responses. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. Can I, of course, acknowledge for meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. To thank Mark and Roger and Michael, Inside Canberra, NATSEM and ANSOG for putting on a terrific event. My only quibble, of course, as an economist, is the breaching of the no free lunch principle, which we hold sacred, but we can discuss the downside of that later. I'm very pleased in particular to share the stage with Paul Porteous, with whom I studied for a little while on the other side of the world, Ben Phillips, who is a vital part of making sure that the public understands the distributional effects of policy and that great NATSEM legacy, and the two Grattans, the Grattan Institute, headed by John Daley, and Michelle Grattan, who is, of course, an institution in her own right, the doyen of the Press Gallery. It's a real honour to be here with all of you. In my view, we ought to assess Budget 2014 based on three simple principles. First of all, what does it do to the deficit? Secondly, has it kept faith with the Australian people? And thirdly, does it meet the fairness test? So let me go through each of those in turn. In terms of the impact of the budget on the deficit, I think many Australians would say, well, yes, there's been a contribution made to what the Treasurer would call budget repair. But the downside of that is what you're doing is comparing Joe 2014 with Joe 2013. The government brought down a budget update last year that doubled the deficit, and its every attempt since then has been to compare this budget with the budget update. That should have been ruled out in the late 1990s when Peter Costello brought out the Charter of Budget Honesty, which said that during the election period, the Secretaries of Treasury and Finance would bring down a pre-election economic and fiscal outlook, which would lay bare the state of the books and with which any later budget decisions could be compared. Compared with that independent assessment, what's striking about Budget 2014, hashtag Budget 2014, is that it has increased the deficit this year, it's increased the deficit next year, and it's increased the deficit over the forward estimates. This is a budget that increases the deficit compared to the way the budget was when the government took office. Now, there's a number of reasons that that's the case. Partly the government has said no to significant sources of revenue. These include the carbon price, which isn't just the most effective and efficient way of dealing with climate change, but is also accounting for somewhere between $12 and $20 billion of revenue over the forward estimates. There's the mining tax, which according to Joe Hockey will raise nearly $2 billion in 2016-17, certainly more money than is raised by the deficit levy. And there's going soft on multinational profit shifting, a painfully obtuse area of taxation, but one that's critically important as companies globalise. Around $1 billion of revenue has been lost, the government going soft on multinational profit shifting. As they say, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and soon you're talking real money. And on top of that has been some extra spending measures. There's parental leave, which is hidden in the contingency reserve, but then there's smaller decisions. For example, over the last 6 years, the non-concessional cap on super contributions has remained at $150,000. This year it was pushed up to $180,000. That's $40 billion of new spending going to people who are putting more than 150 grand a year into super. What sort of an income do you need to have to put more than 150 grand a year into the super? Well, say you're contributing 15%, I'd say that's $1 million income every year. An extraordinary set of priorities to put $40 million into super for the top end while you're shutting down legal aid centres. And that brings me to the second question. What does this do to the breach of faith with the Australian people? I think no politician in the history of Australian politics has been so unequivocal with the Australian people that they would keep their promises as Tony Abbott. If there has been one thing that Australians have known about Tony Abbott over the last few years, it's that he would stick to his pledges. He told us this innumerable times. We're wearing suits and fluoro jackets in every workplace in the country, every state and territory of the country. But the promises that have been broken are significant. Not just the no new taxes pledge, but the cuts to health and education. The NT Chief Minister says there'll be 1,200 hospital beds closed across the country, and not in 4 years' time, but in 43 days' time. The cuts start flowing from the July 1st of this year. The cuts to education you can see simply by looking at the education funding line, which flattens significantly. And the cuts to the ABC and to SBS are seen in the scrapping of the ramp-up program by ABC. All of this is, I think, particularly egregious in an environment in which Mr Abbott said that he would be different, that he wouldn't cut pensions, and that, in particular, you could judge him based on what he said before the election. I wish, of course, there were a coalition member to respond to me, but I suspect they've chosen not to come along today, either because they're basking in the reflected glory today of protesters, pollsters and premiers, or maybe because they just stopped for a cigar on the way. The third test that I think any budget has to meet is the fair go test. This matters particularly in Australia, in which inequality has been rising significantly, in which earnings for the top 10% have risen 3 times as fast as earnings for the bottom 10% since the mid-1970s, in which the top 1% share has doubled and the top 0.1% share has tripled. An Australia in which the richest 3 Australians have more wealth than the poorest 1 million Australians. In that environment, we have to ask ourselves, how have battlers made out compared to billionaires? And as Ben Phillips has outlined so astutely for you, so much of the pain in this budget falls on the bottom of the distribution. For the top, there's the parental leave scheme, there's the better tax deal for multinationals and for superannuants with multi-million dollar balances. But at the bottom, there's the proposition that a 20-something who loses their job might not be able to get any unemployment assistance for 6 months, during which period I worry that they'll suffer homelessness and that mental illness could well be exacerbated. There's the mindless cuts to legal aid, to Indigenous programs, to so many of the supports the vulnerable Australians rely on. So ultimately, what you have with this budget, I think, is not a budget which pays down debt faster, because it doesn't. It actually pays down debt a little slower. But you've got a budget that redistributes. The metaphor I like to think of when we think of budgets is that for most Australians, those who put together the budgets are a bit like the plumber. Apologies to my friends in Treasury when I say this. But, you know, most Australians don't notice the good work you do, so long as things are flowing all right. But when it starts to back up, that's when people really look to see what's going on. And I think Australians are now looking at a system where things are starting to back up, where the government has decided that they can put aside $40 million for multimillionaires to get a better tax deal on their superannuation by taking that money away from pensioners and low-income families. This is a redistributive budget, but not in the sense we tend to use the word. It's a budget that is going to increase the gap between the haves and the have-nots, while keeping the return to surplus trajectory the same, even a little slower than it was before. I think it's the wrong set of priorities for Australia at any time, but particularly the wrong set of priorities in an Australia which has become so much more unequal over recent decades. It's a budget which I think needs to be carefully scrutinised, as this panel has today, and hopefully one that can be sent back to the drawing board to produce a better solution. Look, thanks very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And with John, we had the image of the patient, and with Andrew, the plumber. I sort of know, I think Ben at the beginning said it was scary being in the budget lockup. I'm sort of interested in what happens in there now with that imagery of the plumber and things going backwards in a sense. But of course, it also gets to the heart of what is the intent of the budget. And as said at the beginning, this notion of it being representative of values and priorities within the community. And yet the response from the community as a whole seems to be, and certainly in the media as we're seeing it, has tended to be very concerned about a number of the inequalities, the trust issues, which a number of our speakers have reflected on. Michelle Grattan, of course, one of Australia's most influential political journalists and editor of The Conversation, is going to reflect on what's the political implications of this. Within just a series of a week, it seems as though the fortunes of the government have gone from a strength of we're going to fix this emergency to being widely criticised. What's going on, Michelle? How can we make sense of this? Thank you.
Well, as a political writer, I always think it's good to have economists around, but it's quite formidable to follow this bevy of them. However, we'll try. It will be a while, I think, before we know the long-term political impact of Tuesday's budget. But it is clear at this early stage that the government has put a lot of weight in its saddlebags early in its term. And I think this has come about basically for three reasons. Firstly, Tony Abbott took out far too much insurance before the elections with his promises that almost certainly he didn't need to make, not all of them. Secondly, the coalition exaggerated the budget crisis it faced, reducing its flexibility. And thirdly, ideology has been given too much rein in this budget. The Abbott promises were a constraint on framing the budget, and then they were a curse when some, or indeed many, were broken. They were so extensive that breaches were always going to be inevitable. The coalition had trapped itself. It played the short-term pre-election politics more than it had to, and then it's paid the price by sacrificing its longer-term credibility in office. How it ever thought it was going to get away with such extensive breaches after he'd had so effectively used the trust card against Julia Gillard is, I must say, something of a mystery. The government became victim, I think, of its own propaganda, its sense of economic and political righteousness. To use another description, its own hubris. It thought that it could do what Gillard did in trashing promises, in her case really a single promise, because it wasn't Labor. But one message from today's polls is that it becomes obvious that, at least in the immediate term, people are very willing to apply the same standards to both sides of politics. So they marked the Gillard government down for a breach of promise. They're marking the Abbott government down for its broken promises. If the government had not overhyped its description of the fiscal situation, a situation I think that was more of a difficult problem, certainly in the medium term, than a crisis, it would not have had to resort to such extreme measures. Some of what it's done in the budget on middle class welfare, health and so on would have been much more acceptable if framed in more moderate terms. Yet there's been a contradiction in regard to its own insistence that the fiscal situation is so bad that such harsh measures are inescapable. For example, all the government revenue that's saved from the co-payment is going into the new medical research fund rather than going to the budget bottom line. And this is presumably to deal with the issue of the pre-election pledge that we won't cut health. But in fact, it represents a distortion, worthy as the medical research fund is in itself. And Joe Hockey's argument that investing in research now will in fact find cures and save the health scheme money later, I think is just an example of a total stretch in logic, because I don't think anyone thinks that however good Australian research is, it's going to find these massive breakthroughs in such a way that suddenly, or even over the long term, health costs are greatly reduced. It doesn't work like that. The government also set up criteria for judging the budget, which in fact have come back to bite it. For example, it talked much when there was a leak, in this case an unintended leak. Most of those leaks were very strategic and almost all given out to News Limited, but the one that appeared in News Limited about the high income levy, the first one, was in fact a genuine unintended leak. And when it was defending that proposed levy, it talked a lot about fairness. Ministers said, well, if you're going to have a budget where everyone does the heavy lifting, sounding like some bodybuilding contest, I must say, but anyway, that was the language they used, then you have to deal with the higher income earners, and the only way is to do that when it in fact goes to the tax side. But the trouble was, when the actual budget came out, it was quite clear that even with that tax hike, in fact, the budget, as has been mentioned before by the earlier speakers, is not fair. The lifting is indeed being done disproportionately by those further down the scale. So the government had set up the criteria, everyone looked at the fairness thing, and in fact in today's Nielsen poll, some 6 in 10 plus people condemn the budget as not fair, and this is far more than have found previous budgets over many years to be not fair. Ideology, as well as its own rhetoric, pushed this budget into overreach. Joe Hockey has become obsessed by the whole idea of ending the age of entitlement. And this budget does have the mark of Joe Hockey all over it. Hockey, incidentally, is obviously an aspiring leader for the future, and that came through very much, I think, in the speech he gave on Wednesday, the traditional post-budget speech, which often focuses very heavily on the data and the ins and outs of the budget, but in Hockey's case was very much about values. Now, again, it's a matter of degree. I think that most people these days would think that we do need to target measures more carefully to need, that some measures have become excessive, that you can't do things that maybe 20 years ago were able to be afforded. But this budget, for ideological reasons, I think has taken that far too far. Now, one might have thought that Tony Abbott would be a moderating force in these budget preparations. And he did chair the Expenditure Review Committee all through, which doesn't always happen in the preparation of a budget. Sometimes that chairing, in fact, goes to the Treasurer. But he wasn't that moderating force. And I think there's quite an interesting question to be raised as to why that was. Tony Abbott has had a number of positions on key policy areas over the years. Of course, we all remember the climate change weather vane comment, but also if you have a look at Battle Lines, his book, he has a quite different view on means testing than he does these days. But if we ask why he wasn't more of a moderating force, it does raise the question of whether he's become a real convert to the philosophy of ending the age of entitlement, or whether he judged that that's where the Liberal Party's centre of gravity now is, and he didn't think that it was prudent or possible to be more pragmatic in some areas. Abbott's personal authority and reputation, I think, has taken an enormous hit from this budget. And politically, that is one really important message out of what's happened. Just as Julia Gillard was effectively branded a liar, so that is now how Labor is now describing him. And in a sense, the government's not putting up much of a fight when that term is used. And I think this does have very important implications for both Abbott and for the government. The government has a big agenda coming up, an ambitious agenda with white papers on tax and on federalism and a productivity commission inquiry into industrial relations, and that's just some of the items. Now, these will produce substantial and controversial measures which the government will take, some of them at least, to the 2016 election. And it's hard to see how Abbott can convincingly carry what will be, in any circumstances, quite a difficult election campaign. His problem in trying to repair his credibility is partly that he's never had a huge basis of popularity. We're not talking here like of a Prime Minister like, for example, Bob Hawke, who started really popular, and therefore, even though he had setbacks at various times, he was able to repair and recover. Abbott is not naturally a politician who people are inclined to forgive. Now, I'm not seriously raising leadership speculation here, but I'd merely say that it would be an interesting situation if the coalition trailed Labor for a very long time. The government, I think, has several immediate problems. One is the states, and I can't see it doing much for them in the wake of their complaints, but with 3 Liberal premiers facing election, the squeals are unlikely to stop, and that will be a big irritant for the government. The second problem is the Senate, with Labor, the Greens and Palmer threatening a raft of measures. Now, not all those threatened measures will be blocked. For example, I think the 2 tax rises, petrol and the income tax rise, should be all right because there won't be the required pairings to vote them down. On some measures, the government will undoubtedly have to compromise, and I think it will lose some others. The Medicare co-payment does seem, at this point anyway, to be at high risk, with Labor and the Greens and the Palmerites all being very critical. And the crackdown on the dole for young people also, I think, is really unlikely, you would think, and again you have to stress on present indications, to survive in its current form. Some measures will be dealt with by the old Senate and others will carry through into the new Senate, and that's a further complication. How the Palmer party will behave when it comes to the point is, I think, one of the big unknowns in the aftermath of this budget. Now, Clive Palmer has been going around with firecrackers and essentially causing a merry hell with them. But nevertheless, you have to raise a question about how flexible he will be. For example, on one thing, some of the higher education changes, he started off saying no, and he seems to have come round, I think, after a chat with Christopher Pyne. So there really is no roadmap to be able to predict how he will act. Even before the polls of today, I thought that a double dissolution, the talk of a double dissolution at some point, because Tony Abbott wanted to get rid of the Palmerites and not be under their thumb, as Labor was seen to be under the Greens' thumb, that talk seemed to me pretty fanciful. Such a gamble with a public as fickle as people are nowadays would be an enormous risk for the government. But I think certainly after the poll that we've seen today, the polling generally, we can forget the double dissolution talk. The last thing the voters would want in the next year or so is another election. And as for dealing with the Palmer party, well, the Nielsen poll had PUP on 6%, and the quota for a double dissolution is 7.69%. So you can see that the getting rid of exercise could go really badly wrong. The message certainly from the budget overreach is be very careful of any election overreach. Now, let me end briefly with a note about Bill Shorten. Both Newspoll and Nielsen have him leading decisively as preferred Prime Minister. But Shorten obviously is in that position solely because of Tony Abbott, rather than because of himself. This budget has obviously been a gift to the opposition, and at the moment Shorten is doing very well out of it, just like Abbott before him did very well being Dr. No. But Shorten's challenge is whether he can translate this advantage into a more permanent rebuilding for Labor. He has a great opportunity, but the problem he also has, I think, is that people won't forget quickly their criticism of Labor over the previous years. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And that was great, and we can sort of, add imagery of bodybuilders as well to our plumbers and the others. But the notion of overreach was such a powerful theme that you were putting forward, and that notion, that idea of, to what extent You can be authorised to push those edges and boundaries and still remain viable in terms of trying to make substantive change. One of the things that seems to have come through with all our speakers has been, as well as a focus on specific policies and some of the detail, is a discussion which is far more broad around this issue of trust in government, around inequality, around the effect, in a sense, of what will happen with society, not just now and in this year, but in the future years. And I think that came through strongly, and it's interesting because one wonders whether, and it's a question I'd like to put to the panel, whether there's a whole series of missing conversations, in a sense, that have not been had over the past few years that have ripened in a way. We've heard voices saying, yeah, what sort of society do we want? What level of inequality? What will that look like? But suddenly that seems to have gained a lot of traction in the media, in social media, among community groups, and I travel around Australia a lot, and people are talking about this in a much more open way than before. Is it ripe now for a whole lot of the missing conversations that we haven't been having to actually surface? I was wondering, thoughts on that?
Happy to say a few words. I think that, Paul, you're right, budgets are a good chance to talk about what we believe. One of my challenges as a progressive politician is that I think an erosion of trust in politicians hurts our side disproportionately. So I'm always feeling the balance of wanting to hold the other side to account, but to recognise that in a race to the bottom on trust, the agenda of a party that believes that government has a positive role to play in, say, dealing with disabilities is hurt more than the agenda of a small government party.
I certainly think that the budget did very much present a view based on values, a view based on the nature of society, and what the government was saying was that it thought that there should be a different sort of society. It thought that there should be much more emphasis on the individual, on principles like user pays, on a reduced role for government and an enhanced role for people in looking after themselves, provided you also had a safety net right at the bottom. So I do think it has opened up that broader values, nature of society conversation, as well as just the economic, we need to get back to surplus and fix up spending in the longer term conversation.
Yeah, and that in a sense, that notion I said at the beginning, do we get blinded by a vision of surplus? We've got our two economists here. I mean, a lot of your discussions were very much looking at what's the impact on this, and John, you were very much with a future focus, the structural issues that need to be taken account. How do you balance those out with what Michelle was saying of where there's also some critical issues about values in society that need to be taken account of?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's funny that talk about budget surplus is always assumed to be a sort of right-wing view. And in fact, the people who have the most to lose from governments that run really long-run deficits are in fact those who are most disadvantaged, because when it all goes really badly wrong, as people discovered in Greece, you wind up going hard on welfare and so on because there's nowhere else to go. So I think that's maybe a conversation that needs to mature. I think much more generally, though, the real issue is the one that Michelle raised, which was that this was a government that made a series of fundamentally inconsistent promises when they were in opposition, and then has been struggling to figure out which of those promises to break. And it's very explicitly decided not to break the promise about fixing up the budget, and that strikes me as sensible. But on the other hand, it has been reluctant to look long and hard at the tax side of the budget beyond essentially bracket creep, because that's less obvious, and a levy for very high income earners, which is a very crude way of trying to redress things. I think what this budget will do is put ever more focus on the taxation side and tax reform. I think it was very clearly The Commission of Audit was told that that stuff was outside of its scope. That didn't stop them looking at a number of things, but it did stop them looking long and hard at taxes. And I think what this budget will provoke is a much more detailed look at the taxation reform, and that is a conversation that Australian governments have been very reluctant to look at for a long time. We're already seeing that playing out on the GST. I suspect we'll see it playing out a lot more in terms of superannuation tax concessions. And so I think you're absolutely right. This is a budget that is provoking a lot more thought about values, and I suspect that the way that that will play out more than anything else is in a discussion about tax reform, where obviously as soon as you start talking about tax, you're talking about quite fundamental values.
Absolutely. And, obviously in the governance space, we often say that evidence-based policy is a good idea. Ben, you're there with evidence, putting out the numbers and the like. What's the reaction at the moment to that, particularly from the government side? You sort of, because, even in your speech here, you're saying, look, is the pain being shared? And the answer from the work you're doing, the evidence, is no, it won't be, and that there are inequalities there. What's the sort of reaction to that from a policy perspective with people you engage with?
I guess the perspective that I've seen is that it's what's driving the budget is more of an emphasis around the individual. I guess it's an ideological approach, and that is that those who are lower down the income spectrum are there for reasons such as perhaps being lazy, perhaps not working hard enough, not trying hard enough, and if we only give them a bit of a whack, there'll be a really good, strong response and their life will be better. What I do find interesting about the budget, though, amongst many things, is that this is not actually really reflected in the underlying assumptions of the budget. So the underlying assumptions of the budget isn't that there's been any particular boost to employment, there's been no particular reduction to unemployment, there's no particular boost to income. So they're saying on one hand that what we need to do is we need to encourage people back into the workforce. Many of these people are actually in the workforce anyway. But you're not actually seeing any particular dividend in their bigger macroeconomic picture. So there's a bit of a confusion there. So it's a bit of a surprising sort of conundrum there.
Right, so confusing, inconsistent, various words being put around as everyone struggles with what does this actually mean, both in the short term and the long term. In terms of time, I'm hoping we've got just time for a question or two. How are we going with, if our panel's fine for that? Can I open it up to people if anyone would like to ask a question? Yeah.
Having been
Sorry, oh, sorry. We're doing up the back then.
having been an observer of budgets since the McMahon budget of 1972, I must admit to my reaction watching this budget was that of Talleyrand on the murder of the Duke of d'Enghien. It was worse than a crime, it was a blunder. What astonished me was that this pack of young turkeys rather than young Turks took a machine gun to key elements of their own constituency. In effect, they took a machine gun to Howard's battlers. They attacked single-income conservative families. They attacked middle-class families with students who are now facing American-style levels of debt without American scholarships, which are much more freely available than the ones they're offering. And they scared the hell out of self-funded retirees before they started. But that's the political stupidity of this budget. But what I don't think people have realised is the economic stupidity. What Treasury has done is take an attack on the very families which are producing the future taxpayers it says it needs. It says we have a demographic crisis, so what is its response? But to punish the people producing taxpayers. And what they have missed is that if you want to get rid of middle-class welfare, then you cannot tax the income of 4 or 5 people living on it as though it's 41. So what are they going to do now when students say, we have to have user pays, we have to pay back our debt to society? But why don't you start recovering the age pension out of the states? Why should we be paying tax to subsidise the inheritance of North Shore and Toorak homes? These are the sorts of questions that are going to inevitably blow up. Why don't you tax the foreign investors buying our resources? Or do you let off your friends? So these are the questions that are going to blow up inevitably.
Okay. Thanks for that. Now, I had one more question here. We might just hear that, and then I'll get given time constraints, I'll get our panel to respond.
This was a question for Andrew Leigh. Inequality has obviously been a theme that's very close to your heart. And of course, governments are not the only actor in society with the capacity to affect the welfare of the least well-off in society. So my question to you is, given that you have the capacity as being one of the, a large party to rally various segments of civil society and the business community to deal with some of these problems, what sorts of things might the Labour Party be doing out of office to try to do that? And it's not entirely unreasonable to assume that business interests are completely tone deaf to the least well-off in society. As Bill Goss, the head of PIMCO, the world's largest bond investment company, is raising alarm about growing levels of inequality for the last several years, as eroding consumer bases, or the consumer base, as well as which could lead to greater instability in the economy over time. Because let's face it, low-income earners spend more of their incomes than higher income brackets do. So what sorts of things might the Labour Party be thinking about doing to bring about a fairer go while they're out of office?
Okay. Andrew, you might want to respond to that in the first instance, and then any other comments as we sum up.
I think it's a great question. There's obviously some fairly extreme views in this debate. So, for example, in a week-long special on inequality in the year 2000, Paul Kelly in The Australian said that we should have a serious national debate over an inheritance tax. I think The Australian's position is too extreme, but I do think that there's a variety of interesting discussions that can be had around what you do to ameliorate this highest level of inequality we've seen in 3/4 of a century. Education's got to be pretty fundamental, making sure that our best teachers don't just train on poor kids and then finish their careers on rich kids, but that we have policies to make sure that we get great teachers in front of disadvantaged students. When you cut back on education funding, it's often the equity funding that gets shaved off, which is why I'm particularly worried around education funding. Means testing matters too. We've got a very well-tested, targeted welfare state at the moment, and maintaining that is really vital. But I think too, just maintaining the public conversation around inequality and the sense of pride in being a nation that doesn't typically tip, where we sit in the front seat of taxis, where we've had former central bank governors called Nugget and Nobby, and a billionaire called Twiggy. There's something about that egalitarian set of values that I think will help drive the economic results.
That's great, thank you. And any of our other panel members, as we sum up, sorry we're out of time, but do you, in terms of responding to any of those questions or any observations to sum up? John.
Can I make a brief observation about inequality? I think it's very important that we look after the people towards the bottom of our society, and indeed I think one of the criticisms that is very fairly levelled at this budget is that it has taken money away from people who are right at the bottom who clearly can't afford it. And there is, I don't think anyone lives on Newstart out of choice anymore. And if you look at the work that Ben's done at NATSEM showing the level of financial insecurity and other stress indicators for families on Newstart, they're clearly very severe. And at the point that the Business Council of Australia says that Newstart is too low, it's probably too low. But I think one thing we do have to be careful of is there is no magic to the rank order of that inequality. If there are some people who are marginally worse off at the moment, and who as a result of changes become marginally better off and vice versa, that doesn't actually mean that the policy shift is wrong. And I think there's a real danger in this kind of analysis that looks at, who are the, quote, winners and losers, that there is a real value choice there that you're assuming that the current rank order is perfect. And that strikes me as a very implausible assumption. I think we need to ask, are the changes that are being put in place fair? So if, for example, we are taking money away from family tax benefit B from relatively richer families, and that means that those families will be worse off than people on the same income without children, that's not necessarily a bad outcome. It's changed the rank order, but it's not necessarily a bad outcome. On the other hand, I think we do have to look at the extent to which this budget leaves the most vulnerable in our society even worse off. And that, I think, is a concern. And then to the question around the Liberals' core, or the Coalition's core constituency, I think that's a good question, but actually that's precisely where this rank order fits in. Essentially, the Coalition had a number of policies, particularly benefiting what you might describe as better off pensioners. Pensioners at the bottom do it tough. Pensioners who own their own homes often actually do it quite, not nearly so tough. Similarly, families on reasonable incomes have benefited quite a lot from welfare policy over the last couple of years, and there's no doubt that this budget makes it a little bit tougher for that first group and a reasonable amount tougher for that second group. That doesn't strike me as therefore necessarily bad policy, although it may of course be very bad politics.
Thank you. Ben, did you want to make any final comment?
Oh, look, I think just on that, on the winners and losers, I certainly agree. In politics for far too long we've had too much discussion around small winners and small losers and obsessing about these things. But I guess with respect to this particular budget, when you've got losers at the very bottom end who are losing by $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 per year, their disposable income is down by 10, 15% perhaps, that's just so much of a loser that it sort of goes beyond common sense on that side, I feel. Just too harsh.
And Michelle?
Well, in the run-up to this budget, Andrew was mentioning Paul Kelly, and I went back to look at what had happened in 1993 in the budget. In Paul Kelly's March of Patriots book, there's an extensive discussion of that budget, and I do think there is a big, interesting question about whether this is a 1993 budget. In other words, a budget which was seen as betraying what was promised in an election, and a budget which haunted the Keating government right to the end. And that chapter makes the point that on budget day, the seeds of the death of that government were sown. Now, I'm not saying this is a repeat, but I think that there is a question about whether this is, in fact, will be a repeat, and whether the government has just been too tone deaf in its framing of this budget rather than just bold and brave.
Thank you, and thank you to our whole panel for that. As we sort of look at, and go through that, so much of the discussion has generated, in a sense, a feeling of passion, and we hear it in the questions and also in communities. Just after the budget, I was working up on the Central Coast on youth unemployment. It's almost 30% there, and to say people's reaction on the ground, by young people even, was just, oh, well, who cares, would be the opposite. They were actually extremely engaged, and I would say rather than passionate, angry is probably another word that could be used. So there's a balance here as to what sort of engagement is going to happen. As we've talked through today, we've seen our patients in the doctor, the plumbers getting stuck, the bodybuilders. It's quite colourful for an economic topic and for economists, so there's got to be a good thing in that. But as we think about what those missing conversations are, what the impacts are, and I think one of the issues that's just come out in the final question from the panel as well is, how does a government respond when it receives data back, when it receives information back that people are unhappy or there are mistakes or the policy could be improved, may well be the measure of its sustainability, both politically and also for us economically. And so as that unfolds, the government's response and its level of flexibility in dealing with it may well be the answer to what finally happens as they attempt to get this through the Senate and elsewhere. Thanks very much to our panel for your views, commentary, learned observations, evidence, and we hope to continue with this type of series through NATSEM and the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, and also with Inside Canberra. Thanks for being here today. Please thank our panel. Thank you.